The CEO had always believed he understood his company inside and out. He had built it from the ground up, seen it grow from one small store to hundreds across the country, and watched thousands of employees join over the years. On paper, everything looked good. The profits were strong, customers were loyal, and investors were pleased. But in the back of his mind, he always wondered if he truly knew what was happening in the day-to-day lives of the people who worked at the bottom. Reports and numbers could only say so much. What really mattered was the human experience, and that was something spreadsheets could never capture. For months, he thought about how to find out the truth. He had heard stories about companies where leaders went undercover, pretending to be regular workers just to see how things really were. The idea intrigued him, but it also made him nervous. He had been in a suit and office chair for so long. Could he really blend in with store employees who carried boxes, stacked shelves, and worked long shifts? After weeks of planning, he finally decided to try. He didn't tell anyone except one close advisor. He put on simple clothes, grew a short beard, and wore glasses that he normally never used. He even chose a different name, something plain and ordinary that wouldn't stand out. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't see the powerful man who usually signed contracts and gave speeches at company events. He saw an everyday worker, someone no one would ever suspect of running the business. That was exactly what he wanted. His first day in disguise came on a Monday morning. The store he chose was one of the busiest in the company, located in a crowded part of the city where customers never seemed to stop flowing in and out. As he walked through the sliding doors carrying nothing but a backpack, he felt more nervous than he had in years. No one looked at him twice. To them, he was just another new hire, another face in a sea of workers trying to make a living. The manager on duty introduced him quickly, then sent him to the stockroom to help unload boxes. He kept quiet, watching and listening more than talking. The work was tiring, but it gave him a chance to see how employees treated each other when they thought no one important was watching. Most people seemed friendly enough, chatting as they worked, sharing small jokes to make the heavy lifting easier. But it didn't take long for him to notice something different, something that made his stomach tighten. There was one worker, a young black woman, who stood out to him right away. Not because she was loud or trying to draw attention, but because of how she carried herself. She worked harder than most, moved faster than anyone else in the room, and kept her head down. Yet despite her efforts, the manager's tone with her was sharper than with the others. Whenever she made the smallest mistake, the manager scolded her in front of everyone, making comments that sounded less like correction and more like humiliation. At first, the CEO told himself he might be imagining it. Maybe the manager was just strict with everyone. But as the day went on, he saw the difference clearly. When another worker misplaced a box, the manager laughed it off. When the young woman did the same, the manager's voice turned cold and biting, reminding her loudly to pay attention while others looked away awkwardly. The unfairness was clear, but no one said a word. The CEO kept his thoughts to himself. He didn't want to blow his cover on the very first day, but inside he felt something shift. This was exactly the kind of thing he had wanted to see, the truth that reports and numbers never showed. Here was a manager who acted like a leader when higher-ups visited, but behind the scenes treated certain employees with disrespect. And the worst part was how normal it seemed to everyone else, as if they had grown used to it. By lunchtime, he sat quietly at a corner table in the break room, eating a sandwich he had brought from home. Around him, groups of employees gathered, chatting about their families, rent, and weekend plans. He listened closely, not just to their words, but to their tone. He could hear weariness in their voices, the kind that came from long hours and little recognition. But he also heard kindness, people sharing food, offering advice, even laughing together to escape the weight of the job. The young woman, the one the manager had been so harsh with, sat alone at another table. She picked at her food quietly, her shoulders slightly hunched as though she wanted to make herself invisible. A few times she glanced up as if hoping someone might join her, but no one did. Not because they disliked her, the CEO thought, but perhaps because they were afraid of drawing the manager's attention if they got too close. It was a quiet kind of isolation, the kind that hurt more than open conflict. The CEO wanted to walk over and speak to her, but he stopped himself. If he showed too much interest, it might raise suspicion. Instead, he made a mental note. He would find a way to talk to her later, maybe while working side by side in the stockroom. For now, he just watched, trying to understand the unspoken rules of this store. The afternoon passed slowly with more boxes to unload and shelves to stock. His arms ached and his back was sore, but he kept moving. He wanted to experience the same exhaustion his employees felt, to know what it was like to spend hours on your feet with little rest. He realized how easy it was sitting in his office to forget the physical toll of the job. Numbers on a screen never showed sweat, sore muscles, or the quiet sigh of a worker too tired to speak. By the end of his shift, he was more exhausted than he expected. But as he clocked out, he felt something stronger than fatigue: determination. He had only been there one day, but already he had seen enough to know his company wasn't as perfect as he thought. Behind the smiles and polished customer service, there were cracks. And in those cracks, people were suffering quietly, hoping someone would notice. Walking home that evening, blending into the crowd of workers heading back from long shifts, he replayed the scenes in his mind. The harsh tone of the manager, the silence of the other employees, the quiet sadness of the young woman sitting alone. He had gone undercover to learn the truth, and already he had found it. But he also knew this was only the beginning. If he truly wanted to uncover everything, he would have to stay longer, watch more closely, and be patient. As he lay in bed that night, his body sore and his mind restless, he thought about what he had seen. For the first time in years, he felt like he was seeing his company not as a CEO, but as a worker, and what he saw was both heartbreaking and eye-opening. Somewhere deep inside, he promised himself that by the time this undercover journey ended, things would be different. But for now, he had to remain quiet. Tomorrow he would return to the store as just another face in the crowd, another worker stacking boxes and sweeping floors. No one would know the truth. Not yet. And as he drifted to sleep, he thought of the young woman again, her quiet strength in the face of humiliation. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew one thing for certain: he would not forget her. She was the reason he had to keep going, the reason he had to uncover everything. The next morning, the undercover CEO walked back into the store with sore arms and a stiff back. He felt the ache from lifting boxes the day before, but he reminded himself that this was the daily reality for many of his employees. For them, it wasn't just 1 or 2 days of heavy lifting. It was every day, week after week, often without thanks. He had come here to see the truth, and now he was living it. The store was already busy when he arrived. Customers streamed in and out, workers rushed between aisles, and the faint hum of announcements filled the air. He clocked in, grabbed his badge, and was assigned once again to the stockroom. This time he made sure to position himself close to the young woman he had noticed the day before. He wanted to understand more about her, to hear her voice, to see how she carried herself when the manager wasn't breathing down her neck. She worked quickly, stacking items onto carts, her movements efficient and practiced. She rarely looked up, as though eye contact with others might slow her down. The CEO tried to find a way to start a casual conversation without drawing too much attention. "You move fast," he said softly, offering a small smile. "I'm still trying to keep up." She glanced at him briefly, then gave a polite nod. "You'll get used to it," she replied. Her voice was gentle but cautious, as though she had learned not to say too much. He wanted to ask more, but before he could, the manager stormed into the stockroom. The energy in the room shifted immediately. Conversations died down and workers straightened their backs, moving with exaggerated speed. The manager scanned the room like a hawk, his eyes narrowing on the young woman. "You call this stacking?" the manager snapped, pointing at the cart she had just filled. "Look at it, sloppy, do it again." The woman's face tightened, but she didn't argue. She quietly began restacking the items, her hands moving quickly to fix what didn't seem wrong in the first place. The CEO clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay quiet. His instinct was to step in to defend her, but he knew he couldn't. Not yet. If he spoke up now, his cover would be blown and he would lose the chance to see the full picture. Still, it pained him to stand by. As the day went on, the same pattern repeated itself. The manager barked orders, often singling out the same woman for criticism. Sometimes the remarks were sharp. Other times they carried a mocking tone that made the other workers lower their eyes in discomfort. The unfairness was obvious. The CEO saw it in the way people avoided looking at her, afraid that any sign of sympathy might turn the manager's anger on them too. At lunch, the CEO made another attempt to sit near her. He noticed she always sat at the same corner table, alone, eating quietly. Today, he walked over with his tray and asked, "Mind if I sit here?" She looked surprised but nodded. "Sure." For a while they ate in silence. He didn't want to push too hard, so he started with small talk. "How long have you worked here?" he asked. "Almost 2 years," she replied, still keeping her eyes on her food. "2 years?" he said. "You must know this place better than anyone." She gave a small shrug. "I know enough." He could sense the walls she had built around herself. It wasn't that she didn't want to talk. It was that she had learned it was safer not to. He decided not to press further. Instead, he shared a small piece of his own story, one that wasn't quite true but close enough. "This is new for me," he admitted. "I've never worked in a place like this before. I'm still figuring it out." For the first time, she looked at him directly. Her eyes softened just a little. "It's not so bad once you get used to it," she said. "You just keep your head down and do your work." He nodded, even though he knew she deserved more than just surviving each day. He wanted to tell her that she deserved respect, that she had value far beyond what this manager could ever see. But he stayed quiet, letting the silence between them feel safe rather than heavy. Later that afternoon, the manager called a staff meeting. Everyone gathered in the break room, standing shoulder to shoulder. The manager's tone was sharp as he listed mistakes from the past week. Items misplaced, customers complaining about long lines, shelves not being stocked quickly enough. But instead of spreading the blame fairly, he seemed to direct most of his anger toward the same young woman. "This store runs on discipline," he barked. "If some people can't handle that, maybe they don't belong here." The room was quiet. No one dared speak. The CEO looked around at the faces of the employees, tired, resigned, silently enduring. He realized that this wasn't just about one worker being humiliated. It was about a culture of fear. People had learned to stay quiet because speaking up never led to change. And in that silence, unfairness grew unchecked. That night, after his shift ended, the CEO walked home with heavy thoughts. He knew what he had witnessed was wrong. But he also knew he needed more than just his word to confront it. He needed to understand how deep this problem ran. Was it just one bad manager, or was this attitude spreading through other stores too? How many employees had suffered silently without anyone noticing? The next few days, he paid close attention to everything. He watched how schedules were assigned and noticed the young woman was often given the hardest shifts, closing late at night and opening early the next morning. He listened to how the manager spoke differently to certain workers, showing favoritism to some while cutting down others. He even heard a few quiet conversations among employees, whispered complaints about unfair treatment, but always ending with the same words. "Don't bother reporting it." Nothing changes. The CEO's heart sank. This wasn't just about one person being unkind. It was about a broken system where voices weren't heard, where fear silenced people who deserved better. Every day he spent undercover, he saw more layers of the truth unfolding, and with each layer, his determination grew stronger. On the 4th day, he finally had another chance to speak privately with the young woman. They were both in the stockroom, stacking shelves side by side. The manager wasn't around and the room was quiet except for the sound of boxes being opened. "You work really hard," he said softly. "I've noticed." She glanced at him, almost surprised by the compliment. "Thanks," she replied. Then after a pause, she added, "It doesn't really matter, though. No one sees it." "I see it," he said. His voice was steady, though inside he felt a rush of emotion. "And I think others do too, even if they don't say it." She looked at him for a long moment as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, she gave a small nod, her eyes glistening with something between gratitude and exhaustion. She didn't say more, but she didn't have to. That single look told him everything, how much it meant just to be recognized even in the smallest way. By the end of that week, the CEO knew he had uncovered something much bigger than he expected. What he had hoped would be a simple check-in on company culture had turned into a painful discovery of injustice and silence. He had started this journey with curiosity, but now he felt responsibility pressing down on him. He couldn't just observe anymore. He had to act, but he also knew timing was everything. If he revealed himself too soon, the truth might get buried. The manager might deny everything, and employees might be too afraid to speak out. He had to be careful, patient, and strategic. As he left the store that evening, the city lights glowing around him, he thought about the promise he had made to himself on the first day, to uncover everything and make things right. Now, After only a handful of days, he had seen enough to know this wasn't just about numbers or policies. It was about people, about dignity, about fairness, and deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of what he was about to uncover. The CEO returned to the store the next week with a heavier heart than before. Each day he came in, he noticed more of the same patterns. The manager's words were sharp and cutting when directed at certain employees, especially the young woman he had first noticed. And yet others seemed to glide through shifts with ease, receiving smiles and lighter workloads. The unfairness was no longer something he had to look for. It was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. He knew he couldn't just rely on what he saw with his own eyes. He needed to hear from the people themselves. Their voices would tell him more than silent observation ever could. But getting them to open up wasn't easy. Most employees seemed wary, careful with their words, as though speaking too freely might cost them their jobs. One afternoon, while stacking items in an aisle, he struck up a quiet conversation with an older worker who had been there for years. The man's hair was graying and his movements were slower, but there was a steadiness about him. "You've been here a while, right?" the CEO asked. "Too long." The worker chuckled softly, though there was no joy in his laugh. "Do you like it?" the CEO asked carefully. The man looked around before answering. "It pays the bills," he said. "But you learn fast to keep your head down." "That's the only way to survive here." The CEO nodded. He let the silence stretch, hoping the man might say more, and slowly he did. "There are good people here," the worker continued. "Most of us just want to do our jobs. But management," he shook his head. "Some folks get treated better than others. You see it, don't you?" The CEO met his eyes and gave a slight nod. He didn't need to say more. The man's expression told him he had lived with this knowledge for years, powerless to change it. Later that same day, the CEO noticed the young woman again, working quickly at the register while the manager hovered nearby. A small mistake in the transaction, barely noticeable, gave the manager the excuse he seemed to be waiting for. "Can you not follow basic instructions?" the manager said loudly enough for customers to hear. The woman's cheeks flushed and she apologized quietly, fixing the issue. Customers looked uncomfortable, some glancing away, others watching with disapproval at the manager's tone. But no one said anything. When the line cleared, she lowered her head, her hands trembling slightly as she continued scanning items. The CEO's chest tightened. He had seen enough now to know this wasn't a one-time problem. It was a pattern. But what stunned him most wasn't just the manager's behavior. It was how normalized it had become. Everyone seemed to accept it as if it were just part of the job. That evening, as he sat in his small rented apartment, he began jotting down everything he had seen. He kept a notebook hidden in his bag, writing in detail about each incident. The tone of voice, the words used, the expressions on the employees' faces, he documented it all. It felt strange, like he was building a case, but he knew evidence would matter later. If change was to happen, it had to be undeniable. Over the next few days, he made an effort to connect more with the workers. Slowly, he gained their trust. One woman in the bakery section confided in him that she had asked for a schedule change to care for her child. But the manager had denied it without reason, while approving a less urgent request for another worker. "It's always like that," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the stockroom door. "Some people get favors. Others get nothing. I don't even bother asking anymore." Another employee, a young man who worked late shifts, admitted he had been written up twice for minor mistakes, while others were never disciplined for bigger ones. "It's not fair," he said quietly. "But if you say something, you just make yourself a target." The CEO listened to each story with care, never pushing too hard, always showing that he was simply a fellow worker sharing their struggles. Inside, though, his heart burned. These were people who deserved respect, yet they were treated as if their dignity didn't matter. The young woman he had first noticed remained at the center of his thoughts. She seemed to carry the heaviest burden, yet she never lashed out or complained. Instead, she worked with quiet determination, even when the weight of humiliation pressed down on her shoulders. One night, as they were both assigned to clean the aisles before closing, he found himself working beside her again. The store was quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. "You're always the last one here," he said softly, pushing a mop across the floor. She shrugged. "Someone has to do it. Do you ever think about leaving?" he asked gently. her hand stilled on the broom handle. She hesitated before answering. Sometimes, but I need this job. It's not easy to find another one that fits my schedule. And even if I did, there's no guarantee it would be better. The CEO nodded, feeling the weight of her words. For her, staying wasn't just about stubbornness. It was about survival. She couldn't afford to take chances, not when bills and responsibilities left her with no room to fail. I see how hard you work, he said. Don't think it goes unnoticed. She gave him a small, tired smile. Thank you, she whispered. It was a simple exchange, but he knew it mattered. Sometimes the smallest acknowledgement could be a lifeline. By the end of that week, the CEO had gathered enough experiences to realize the problem wasn't just one manager's cruelty. It was the silence surrounding it. Employees had learned that speaking out brought no change, so they endured quietly, hoping the storms would pass. And in that silence, the manager's behavior grew bolder, more unchecked. One Friday afternoon, something happened that shook even the most silent of workers. The young woman had been assigned to restock an aisle, but she was also called to help at the register when the line grew long. Juggling the two tasks, she moved quickly, but in her rush, she forgot to bring a price label for one of the items. The manager pounced immediately. How many times do I have to tell you? He shouted across the aisle. It's not that hard. Do you even pay attention? Customers stopped and stared. The young woman froze, her face turning pale. She apologized and tried to fix the issue, but the manager kept going. His words growing sharper, louder, each one cutting into her like a blade. The room fell silent. Even the other workers, usually quick to avoid attention, looked visibly upset. One whispered quietly, "That's too much." Another shook their head in disgust. For the first time, the CEO saw cracks in the silence. People weren't just uncomfortable anymore, they were outraged. Inside, the CEO's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to rip off his disguise right then, to expose himself and put an end to it all, but he forced himself to stay calm. The moment wasn't right yet. He needed the full picture, and he needed the employees to feel safe enough to speak when the time came. That evening, as the store closed and the last customers left, he noticed the young woman wiping tears from her eyes as she gathered her things. She tried to hide it, turning her face away, but he saw, and in that moment he made himself a promise. He would not let this go on much longer. He would gather what he needed, and then he would act. The manager might think he held all the power, but soon, the truth would come to light. Walking home that night, the city streets buzzing with traffic and voices, the CEO felt more determined than ever. He had come undercover to understand his company, but what he uncovered was deeper than he expected. It wasn't just about sales or efficiency. It was about dignity, respect, and humanity. And no profit in the world was worth ignoring that. As he closed his notebook that night, filled with stories, details, and quiet voices finally given space, he knew the time was coming soon. He wasn't just an undercover boss anymore. He was a witness. And soon he would become the voice those workers needed. The week had been long, and the undercover CEO felt the weight of everything he had seen pressing on his shoulders. Each night he went home and thought about the young woman, about the unfairness, and about the tired faces of the employees who had shared their stories with him in whispers. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had gathered enough proof in his mind and in his notes. The time had come to stop watching in silence and reveal who he really was. But timing mattered. If he walked in one morning and announced himself, it would shock people but might not open their hearts. He needed a moment when the truth would be undeniable, when the employees would feel safe enough to finally speak out. That moment, he felt, was close. It came on a rainy afternoon. The store was busy, customers dripping water from their umbrellas as they rushed through the aisles. The staff moved quickly to keep up with the demand. But the manager was in one of his worst moods. His voice carried across the store like thunder, scolding workers for moving too slowly, for restocking too late, for not smiling enough at customers. The young woman was assigned to the register again. The line stretched long and she moved as fast as she could, scanning items and bagging them neatly. A small error with the register code slowed her down, and that was all it took. "Are you serious?" The manager barked loudly, walking over in front of customers. "How many times do you need to make the same mistake before you learn?" The store went quiet. Customers looked up, uncomfortable, while other employees froze in their tracks. The young woman kept her eyes down, her face pale, and apologized softly. But the manager wasn't finished. He leaned closer, his voice sharp and mocking. Maybe this isn't the job for you. Maybe you should think about finding work you can actually handle. That was the breaking point. The CEO felt his chest tighten, anger rising like a fire. He couldn't stand back any longer. This was the moment. He stepped forward, his disguise still on, but his voice stronger than ever. That's enough. The manager turned, surprised. Excuse me? I said that's enough, the CEO repeated, his tone steady. You don't get to talk to her like that. The room went silent. All eyes turned to the two men. Employees looked shocked, some even afraid, as though this outburst might cost him his job. But the CEO didn't back down. The manager's face turned red. Who do you think you are talking to me like that? You're just a new hire. Don't forget your place. The CEO took a deep breath. He reached up and removed his glasses. Then he wiped away the short beard he had glued on that morning. When he straightened up, his true face was revealed. Gasps filled the room. The employees stared in disbelief, whispering to each other as recognition spread. The manager froze, his mouth hanging open. His tone faltered. Wait, you're... Yes, the CEO said firmly. I'm the CEO of this company, and I've been working here undercover for weeks. The store erupted into stunned silence. Some employees looked wide-eyed. Others covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were seeing. The young woman at the register dropped her scanner in shock, her hands trembling. The CEO turned to the employees, his voice carrying across the room. I came here because I wanted to see the truth of how my people are treated. I wanted to understand what life is like on the floor, not just from reports and numbers, but from real experience. And what I've seen has left me deeply disappointed. He turned back to the manager. Your behavior has been unacceptable. I've watched you humiliate hard-working employees, especially this young woman, over and over again. I've seen you give unfair schedules, deny requests, and treat people with disrespect while hiding behind your authority. This is not leadership. This is abuse. The manager's face grew pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The CEO's voice grew stronger. Let me make one thing very clear. This company was built on values of respect and fairness. No one, no matter their background, no matter their position, should ever be made to feel less than they are. And you have failed to live up to that standard. For the first time, the employees began to stir. Some nodded quietly, others whispered in agreement. The silence that had once been filled with fear now began to break. The young woman stood frozen, tears welling in her eyes. She seemed almost unable to believe what was happening, as though the burden she had carried alone for so long was finally being lifted. The CEO looked directly at her. His voice softened. You've worked hard every single day. I've seen your dedication, your strength, and your quiet resilience. You deserve to be treated with respect, not humiliation. I am sorry for what you have endured. Her lips trembled and tears slipped down her cheeks. She nodded, unable to speak, but the relief on her face said everything. The CEO then addressed the room again. To all of you, I want you to know this. Your voices matter. If you have ever felt silenced, ignored, or mistreated, I am here to listen. This stops now. Things will change, not just in this store, but across the company. The employees began to clap, softly at first, then louder, until the break room was filled with the sound of hands coming together. Some smiled through tears, others looked at each other with hope in their eyes. It was as if a weight had been lifted from the entire team. The manager stood there, still stunned, his authority crumbling before everyone's eyes. The CEO looked at him one last time. You will no longer be managing this store. Effective immediately, you are removed from your position. There will be a full investigation into your conduct. And believe me, the evidence speaks for itself. The manager's face burned red with embarrassment. He tried to protest, but the words sounded weak and hollow in the air, now filled with the employees' applause. The CEO didn't linger. He turned back to the workers, his voice calm again. I didn't come here today to embarrass anyone. I came here to see the truth. And the truth is that you deserve better. Better leadership, better respect, better recognition for the hard work you do every day. I promise you this company will change starting right here. The applause grew louder, and for the first time since he had entered Undercover, the CEO felt the employees' spirits lift. They looked at him not as a stranger in disguise, but as someone who had seen them, truly seen them, and chosen to stand on their side. The young woman wiped her tears and looked at him with gratitude that words couldn't capture. For her, this moment was more than just justice, it was hope. And for the CEO, it was the reminder of why he had built this company in the first place. Not just for profits, but for people. That evening, as the store closed and the rain continued to fall outside, the CEO sat alone in his office. He felt exhausted but relieved. The hardest part, the reveal, was done, but he knew this wasn't the end. What came next was just as important. Promises meant nothing without action. He thought about the faces of his employees, the tired older worker, the mother in the bakery, the young man afraid of being written up, and most of all, the young woman who had endured so much humiliation. Their stories were now his responsibility. He couldn't turn away. As he closed his notebook that night, he wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. Tomorrow begins the change, and with that, he knew the journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The next morning felt different in the store. The air that was once heavy with fear seemed lighter. The workers came in quietly at first, unsure of what would happen after yesterday's dramatic reveal. But there was something new in their steps, something closer to hope. The CEO arrived early, no longer in disguise. He wore a simple shirt and stood by the entrance, greeting employees as they walked in. Some were hesitant, others smiled nervously, but most of them seemed relieved to see him still there. They now knew the truth, that he hadn't come to spy or to play a game, but to understand them. The young woman who had endured the manager's harshness the most walked in slowly. She looked down at first as if unsure if she should even meet his eyes. But when the CEO smiled warmly and said, "Good morning," she finally looked up and returned a small smile. That single moment said more than words could. The day began with a meeting in the break room. The CEO wanted every employee there. He stood in front of them, his voice calm but firm. "Yesterday was a turning point," he began. "But today is about moving forward. This company is not built by one person at the top, it is built by all of you. Every hour you work, every task you do keeps this place alive. That deserves respect. From now on, we will make sure you receive it." The employees sat quietly, listening closely. Some nodded. Others looked as if they might cry. For many of them, it was the first time someone from the top had ever spoken to them like this. The CEO continued, "There will be changes. Better schedules, fair treatment, and open communication. I will set up a system where you can share your concerns directly without fear of punishment. No more silence. No more fear." The applause that followed wasn't loud at first, but it grew as people found courage in each other's hands coming together. The young woman clapped too, though her eyes were wet with tears. After the meeting, the CEO spent the day moving around the store. He helped unload boxes in the stockroom, carried trays in the bakery, and even bagged groceries at the register beside the young woman. Customers watched with curiosity, whispering when they realized who he was. But he didn't care about appearances. He wanted his employees to feel that he was not just a distant figure in an office tower, but someone willing to work beside them. During a short break, the young woman finally spoke to him. Her voice was soft but steady. I didn't think anyone would ever notice," she said. "I noticed," he replied gently, "and I'm sorry it took me so long to come here. But I promise you things will be different now." She nodded, a faint smile on her lips. For the first time, her eyes carried hope instead of fear. As the days went on, the changes began. The cruel manager was officially removed, and a new interim supervisor was brought in, someone known for fairness and kindness. The schedules were adjusted to be more reasonable, giving workers proper breaks and enough hours to live on. The company also launched a new program, an anonymous feedback system so employees could share concerns without fear of retaliation. But more than policies, it was the spirit of the place that shifted. People no longer whispered in fear when the manager passed. They laughed more freely, they worked together with more energy, and even the customers noticed the difference. One afternoon, the CEO called the young woman into his office. She walked in nervously, unsure why she had been asked. He gestured for her to sit. "I want to talk about your future," he said kindly. She looked surprised. "My future?" "Yes, you've shown strength, patience, and dedication through some very difficult times. That's not something many people could do. I believe you have the qualities of a leader. Would you be open to training for a higher role in this company?" Her eyes widened.
"Me? But—"
"I'm just—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You're not just anything," the CEO interrupted gently. You're the kind of person we need. Someone who understands what it feels like to be treated unfairly, and someone who can make sure others are treated with respect. You don't have to decide right now. Just know that the opportunity is here if you want it. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from hope. She nodded slowly, whispering, "Thank you." The CEO smiled. "You don't have to thank me. You've earned it." Word spread quickly among the employees, and many of them celebrated her opportunity. She had become a symbol, not of weakness, but of resilience and change. If someone who had been silenced for so long could rise, then maybe all of them could believe in a better future too. Weeks turned into months, and the store continued to transform. The CEO visited often, not just to check in, but to work alongside his team. He listened to their stories, their struggles, and their hopes. Each conversation reminded him why he had built this company in the first place, not just for numbers and profits, but for people in their lives. The young woman, once quiet and unsure, began her training. At first she was nervous, afraid she would fail. But with encouragement and support, she grew more confident. She learned how to manage schedules, how to resolve conflicts fairly, and how to motivate her team with kindness instead of fear. Slowly, she stepped into the role of a leader, not the kind that ruled with power, but the kind that lifted others up. One evening, as the store closed and the last customer left, the CEO stood at the door watching the employees finish their tasks. The laughter, the teamwork, and the warmth filled the air. He felt a deep sense of pride. The journey had been difficult, but it was worth it. The young woman approached him, smiling. "It feels different now, doesn't it?" she said. He nodded. "It feels alive." She looked around the store, then back at him. "Thank you for seeing us." "For seeing me?" He shook his head. "Thank you for reminding me what really matters." The rain had stopped outside and the air smelled fresh. The CEO knew the work wasn't finished. There would always be challenges, always more to do. But as long as people like her stood strong, the company would never lose its heart again. And so, what began as an undercover mission ended as a story of courage, respect, and change. A story where one young woman's tears turned into hope, and where an entire workplace learned that true leadership is not about power, but about compassion. For the CEO, it was more than a lesson. It was a promise, one he intended to keep for as long as he lived.